Hi there everyone, hope it's going okay today. This video is going to continue our discussion about the fine-tuning argument by turning our attention to some of the worries that have been raised for it and some of the ways a theist might try to defend the argument from these objections. So we're just going to start by reviewing what exactly the fine-tuning argument is and why some people think it provides strong evidence in favor of God's existence. After we do that, we'll turn to the objections, and one of those will come from a famous principle known as the anthropic principle. Another will try to reply to the argument by positing that there might be some more fundamental naturalistic laws for explaining fine-tuning, and then a famous objection that tries to appeal to the possibility of there being a multiverse, and then lastly, an objection that takes a different tact by trying to argue that the theistic hypothesis that there is a perfect God actually does not provide an explanation for the fine-tuning we see in the universe. So what do we mean here by the fine-tuning of the universe again? Well, we mean this idea that we made this observation using modern scientific methods that the physical constants, the laws of nature, and the initial conditions that we find in our universe seem to have the exact values that they would need to have in order to allow for life forms, such as you and I, to develop at some point within the history of our universe. Right. And so this observation is then used as the starting point for what we called the abductive version of this fine-tuning argument. So we make that observation, and the idea is this is incredibly surprising that we find those particular values. There seem to be an infinite amount of values that these laws of nature or initial conditions could have. The initial conditions of our universe didn't need to be what they were. They could have been some other way. We can imagine universes with other kinds of laws of nature and with other kinds of physical constants. Amongst all the possibilities, there only are a very select few, a very small portion, that seem to allow for the development of life, and so we want some sort of explanation for why those ones turn out to be the ones that exist rather than any of the other ones. And so according to this argument, the hypothesis that there exists a traditional theistic God seems to provide a better explanation for the fine-tuning than a hypothesis where there is no such God. And so, since this is the best explanation, we can rashly infer that, at least probably, that hypothesis that there is a traditional theistic God is likely true. Now remember, we saw the 1,000-word philosophy fine-tuning argument, the version of it, that was slightly different. If God does not exist, if atheism is true, then it would be extremely unlikely that the universe would have these exact values. And the idea here is just that if atheism is true, then it looks like which laws and conditions there are is just a matter of random chance. It's like rolling a dice among all the infinite possibilities. And yet again, if there's only a select few initial conditions and laws of nature that would allow for life amongst an infinite amount, well, random chance, it seems much more likely that you end up with one of the other kinds of ways the universe could have been that would not have allowed you or I to exist. All right. And so on the other side, though, but if God does exist, well, then it seems like it would be very likely that our universe would have those exact values, because that God would presumably want there to be life in the universe. And if God is all-knowing, God knows exactly what the dials would have to be set to in order to allow for life. And God is all-powerful. God would then be able to use that power to set the dials exactly where they need to be in order to achieve that goal of allowing life. Right, so notice that mention of the word goal. This is why the fine-tuning argument is a version of a teleological argument. All right, we notice that certain things in the universe seem to be set to particularly effective means to achieving some goal or purpose. Right? And so the idea is, insofar as it looks like there's some purpose to these laws achieving life, that suggests that there might be an intelligent designer that had that purpose, had that goal, and then purposefully set the laws in such a way that make for an effective means to accomplishing that goal. Given all of this, this fact that the universe permits life, that these effective means are present, seems to be strong evidence that God exists. And now I mentioned in the last video that the best way to understand the relationship between this version and the abductive version of the argument is that this particular reconstruction is meant to explain why theism offers the better explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. The first premise is arguing that chance, which is what you'd have to appeal to, it seems, if you were an atheist, doesn't provide a good explanation for fine-tuning, since on that hypothesis, those particular laws would be rather unlikely. The theistic hypothesis seems to be a better explanation because if it were true, it would make it very likely that these particular values would be present. So now that we've reviewed what the argument is and the motivation for it, let's take a look at some of the objections. One of the most famous objections comes from a principle known as the anthropic principle, and it just stems from this idea that if the universe had had some other values for its laws of nature, its physical constants, etc., where those values did not allow for life to develop, well then, you and me, we wouldn't be here in order to observe what the values are. And so we shouldn't be surprised, since we are here, we shouldn't be surprised that when we look at the laws, it turns out that they have exactly the values that are necessary for us to be here. And so there's two ways to understand how this appeal to the anthropic principle is meant to try to raise a worry for the fine-tuning argument. The first is the way that Metcalfe goes in the 1,000-word philosophy article. On this view, the anthropic principle is meant to show that the fine-tuning of our universe is not actually improbable. It's not actually unlikely. The idea here is it's actually rather likely that when we go looking at the laws of nature and initial conditions of our universe, that they turn out to have life-permitting values because we're here to observe them. And if they didn't allow for it, we wouldn't be here to observe them. But on a second reading, it's not really about whether these laws of nature are improbable or unlikely. Another reading you might say is the anthropic principle is meant to show that we shouldn't be surprised that we observe a fine-tuned universe. So even if it's unlikely that we have exactly these laws and these conditions in this universe, it still isn't surprising that when we observe it, we observe those particular values because we're here to observe them, and that's what we should expect if we're here to observe them. Since it's not surprising, even though it's unlikely, we can chalk it up to chance. In the same way, look, it's unlikely that a person gets hit by lightning, but it's not surprising that people sometimes get hit by lightning because those are things that happen all of the time, for instance. So since the fact that someone gets hit by lightning is not surprising, even though it's unlikely, we shouldn't look for some explanation beyond the fact that they were unlucky and they just happened by random chance to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. So how exactly might a theist try to respond to this kind of objection using the anthropic principle? Well, both Metcalfe in the 1,000-word philosophy article and Philip Goff, they mention a famous example that we can just call the firing squad example. Imagine I've been sentenced to death by firing squad. And so 20 people line up with their firearms aimed at me, and then I hear the person in charge yell fire, and I hear all the guns go off. But then I squeeze my eyes tight, waiting for the worst, and then I open my eyes and I'm still there. Something's gone wrong. All the firearms have malfunctioned. And then imagine the person in charge tells them to load up again. And they all shoot again and they all miss again. And then another time, hundreds of times over, and they always miss. Right. At that point, if 20 people with firearms aimed at me and tried to put me to death 100 times over and missed every single time, that's incredibly unlikely to happen. And it's incredibly surprising, even though, notice, that if they hadn't malfunctioned, well then I wouldn't have been around to observe anything. Right, so the anthropic principle applies here. And so the upshot here is, according to Metcalfe, something can be incredibly unlikely, despite it being true that if it had not happened, we wouldn't have been able to observe it's not happening. And similarly, we might say something can be incredibly surprising, despite it being true that if it had not happened, we wouldn't have been able to observe it's not happening. I'm going to test out another way to try to explain what's wrong with using the anthropic principle to reply to the fine-tuning argument in this way. This might be a little bit confusing. It rests on a very subtle distinction, so if students don't understand this, don't worry, just go back to that earlier way of trying to understand it. But what the firing squad example, I think, shows is that we need to distinguish between we make an observation of a fact, and that fact is surprising or improbable. This is different than it being surprising or improbable that an observation we made was an observation of that fact. So in one case, the fact is surprising or improbable, and in the other case, the observation turning out to be what it was is surprising or improbable. It is not surprising or improbable that my observation of the firing squad was an observation of a failed outcome, since I couldn't have made any observation unless there was a failed outcome. So the idea is, given the fact that I made an observation, right, it's not surprising that it was an observation of the firing squad failing. However, even if that's true, the fact that the firing squad failed so many times is still surprising or improbable. You might say, from like a God's eye neutral perspective, this fact is surprising, even if it's not surprising from the perspective of the fact that I'm currently making an observation of it. And yes, it's not surprising or improbable that our observation of the cosmological constants was an observation of fine-tuning, since, as the anthropic principle shows up, we wouldn't have made any observation unless the constants of our universe were finely tuned. So the idea here is, yet again, given that we are here to make an observation, it's not surprising or unlikely that the observation is one of fine-tuning. Nonetheless, the fact that the constants are fine-tuned, like from this God's eye or neutral perspective, is still surprising or improbable. So the fact is surprising or unlikely, even if the observation is not unlikely or surprising. A different kind of objection tries to say, look, maybe there's a purely naturalistic explanation of these values that we see in the universe. Look, we don't know all the scientific or naturalistic laws that govern our universe and its development. It's possible that some of the values of the cosmological constants stem from some more fundamental law. So these kind of things happen in science all the time. We're aware of one law of nature in one domain, and we're aware of another law in another domain, and then we find out that it's no accident that both of those come together, since they actually both stem from some more general principle. And so the idea is, if there is some further deeper law to explain why we get these values rather than others, then it might turn out that the fine-tuning of our universe is likely even on the atheistic hypothesis. Now, a theist would likely respond in the way that Metcalfe suggests. This idea that, well, whatever that more fundamental law turns out to be, it too would also need to be finely tuned for bringing about those cosmological constants, because presumably whatever that fundamental law is, there are other potential fundamental laws that could have obtained instead. And so we would still need an explanation. Whatever that fundamental law is, we would need an explanation for why that exact fundamental law obtains rather than the other fundamental laws that would have not led to these life-permitting cosmological constants. And so the idea of this response is that the appeal to a more fundamental law just pushes the question back. Now, one of the most common ways of actually trying to respond to this is by appealing to the possibility of a multiverse. Right? And on this objection, our universe might not be the only one. And there are several physicists who have suggested that maybe there is evidence in favor of there being a multiverse. Now, I am not a physicist, so I am not in a position to judge how good that evidence is or is not and compare it to other single universe theories. If we take this as at least a genuine possibility, well, then there might be several, maybe even infinite universes with their own laws and constants, all different from one another. So there might be one universe where we have the inverse square law of gravity, like we do, and another universe where we have the inverse cube law. Even if the cosmological constants are a product of chance, on like this atheistic view, well, if there's enough universes, then it would actually become really probable that one of those universes would turn out to have the finely tuned values. You'd likely see all the different values show up in one of these infinite universes, for instance. In the same way, if I roll a dice, it's unlikely that it'll come up a 6. But if I roll that dice 100 times, it becomes a virtual certainty, not quite, that at least one of them will be a 6. Similarly, it might be unlikely that my lottery ticket is a jackpot winner, but if there are 8 billion tickets purchased, then it would be very likely that at least one of those tickets is a jackpot winner. So even if some laws are unlikely in a universe, if we have multiple universes, several of them, it becomes more and more likely that one of them will have the ones relevant to life. And now the kind of response that is often given here by advocates of the fine-tuning argument is to say that the appeal to the multiverse doesn't actually explain the right kind of thing. Right. According to this, the multiverse hypothesis might explain why some universe is finely tuned for life, but what we actually want to explain is we don't know just that some universe allows for life. We need to explain why this universe specifically is finely tuned for life. And the idea is a multiverse theory doesn't explain why this particular universe has the laws of nature that are necessary for life to develop. And lastly, I want to very quickly consider another kind of criticism that claims that theism doesn't really give a good explanation of fine-tuning itself. And on this view, it isn't clear that theism really offers that explanation because theism doesn't explain why God would create a physical universe fine-tuned for life. For one, why wouldn't God choose to create maybe disembodied minds without any kind of physical world? Why create physical creatures at all rather than just non-physical souls, right, that don't require any kind of physical laws? Or why wouldn't God just choose not to create at all? It looks like those are things that an all-powerful being might want to do as well. And so if we want to explain why a physical world with finely tuned constants obtains, we would need some explanation for why one of those choices is more likely than the other for God to make, which might be very difficult to do if you think that the mind of God is actually pretty hard to know, and we shouldn't presume what kind of choices a being would make. But now the kind of response that's given in the Metcalfe is this idea that it seems as if the existence of conscious life forms is objectively valuable. There's something morally good about these kinds of beings existing. And Metcalfe says perhaps only physical beings can be seriously harmed, and so their acts of free will are morally significant. That is, there needs to be the potential for evil and harm in order to get this value of morally significant choices that we can be praised for, right, or blamed for. And so that's maybe one reason why a perfect being would create a physical universe with physical beings like us. And so that ties back into some of the things we said about the problem of evil in our other videos. So that's all for this video. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.